Good morning. This is the House Ways and Means Committee, April 3, 2025. We have another busy day lined up for us, and we're gonna. So, uh, Julia Richter, from Joint Fiscal Office.
As Julia's coming to the witness stand, I did want to say a mea culpa for yesterday. On page 74 of fiscal facts, there is a history of property tax relief and the property tax adjustment, so it's good reading to see what existed pre-1997.
Yeah.
We'll shout out for Joint Fiscal Office fiscal facts book.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Julia Richter with JFO. I was asked to, before Professor Colby goes into all of the details, I was asked by the chair to just sort of level set and remind what we're talking about, policy considerations in terms of a foundation amount, and what are some of the big policy questions. So there is a slide deck on the committee page under my name that outlines some of the high level, thank you, some of the high level state level funding considerations for a foundation amount. So just some of those policy questions to keep in the back of your mind. We're nonpartisan.
So true.
We're gonna get you again.
Should get it printed on a t-shirt, the number of times I've said it in here in the last however many days. But anyways, we're nonpartisan. This is just for you to hold in the back of your mind some questions. So what are we talking about when we're talking about a foundation amount, or as the education finance proposal that the language you've been considering, the education opportunity payment is what the language calls it. This is really talking about multiple factors and policy decisions in the background. So there's a few pieces high level that we've spoken about just to remind the committee. First of all, there's the base amount, right? This determines a fixed dollar amount per student, regardless of circumstances and characteristics, right? The administration's proposal had the 13,200. We've heard other numbers floating around. So this is that base amount upon which pupil counts and weights are applied against. Then we have the student count. This determines the manner of calculating the number of pupils regardless of circumstances or characteristics. So often in this committee, we're talking about long-term average daily membership, the legal name being long-term membership, right? It's a 2-year average essentially of kids with butts and seats. Of course, there's also other ways to count students. And the manner in which students are counted, of course, impacts the funding formula, because we're talking about how many kids exist in a school, exist in a district. And lastly, the sort of the third high level piece when thinking about a foundation amount are the pupil weights. Or when talking about the education opportunity payment, are those pupil weights. And these are determining adjustments to the base amount and or the student count to adjust for certain circumstances or characteristics of students and or of districts. Under current law, of course, we have pupil weights, but the pupil weights we have under current law are tax capacity weights. They were calculated for our current law funding scheme. They were not calculated for a foundation formula. So high level, we're talking about the base amount, the student count, and the pupil weights. And then I just put together a slide with some of the significant questions for a foundation amount to hold in the back of your mind when thinking through these calculations. So it's not an exhaustive list, but thinking about all of these decision trees that we've been talking about over the past weeks, when thinking about the base amount, what is the base amount? What is the actual number for the base amount? What is included in the assumptions of that base amount? What is not included in the assumptions of the base amount? Does the base amount change over time? Right? If you're calculating a base amount based on fiscal year 25 data, should that base amount be adjusted for fiscal year 30 prices and costs and inflation? Right? How is that base amount adjusting? Should it be changed to reflect different circumstances in the educational landscape? So we've got some base amount questions. Then we've got just the high level student count question. How are students counted? Right? Right now we're talking about long-term membership, long-term average daily membership. Is that appropriate? Or is there something else that should be used? And then lastly, some high level questions for weights are, what are the weighting categories? What are you adjusting for? Students, English learners, students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, etc. Within those weighting categories, what are the weights? How are you adjusting the student count or the base amount to account for those weighting categories? And then lastly, I guess sort of the third really high level question is, do the weighting categories or the weights change over time? So of course, there are more questions, but some of these really high level questions when thinking about the calculation of the educational opportunity payment for the foundation amount. And that's all I put together just in terms of sort of framing the conversation for this morning.
Questions? Thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
Welcome, Professor Colby.
Good morning, everyone. I apologize for not being there in person. I was waylaid with the bad weather yesterday and couldn't get home as expected. So I'm joining you today by Zoom, which I know is not the easiest format to do question and answers. So just let me know if you've got questions or comments, and I can try to navigate those. So for the record, Tammy Colby, and I wear multiple hats in the state, and I am here today in my capacity as an education finance expert, but not in my role as a member of the State Board of Education. So what I'd like to do is share my slides and sort of talk through here in a minute, but just like Julia, I thought I might level set for a moment. So what I'm going to present to you is the result of updated analyses that we did based on the 2019 pupil weighting study. So I think in January, when I came to before you, I presented some back of the envelope numbers where we do sort of extrapolated to the extent we could based on the 2019 study what we thought a foundation amount would be, what a sort of a base spending amount would be, and what the weights might look like. We then were asked by JFO and provided detailed data by JFO from JFO to actually go and update our analyses using more current data. So what I'm going to present to you today is the result of that updating exercise. So some of the things you're going to see that I present have changed a little bit from what you saw, what I presented in January. And I just want to make sure that you understand, again, what we're doing. What I did in January was sort of a back of the envelope. I think was more of an example. But these now, what I'm presenting today is these are more precise estimates, and these reflect sort of an update of our models and our analyses using more recent data through the 2003-2004 school year. Again, I can't, once I start to share my screen, I can't see you anymore. So if one of you could just sort of help me know if somebody has a question, just sort of chime in. I don't mind being interrupted. So just sort of let me know. That would be great. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So of course I've got to, why is it? Okay, Zoom's is not cooperating at the moment. I apologize. I apologize once. I don't know why I'm having trouble pulling it up here. Hmm. Why is it not coming up?
Oh,
I
Do you want me
apologize.
to share
One
it?
second, 1 second.
but Kobe, would you like us
It'll
to
be
share?
really hard for me to do if I don't have them up here. I can see them on my screen, but for some reason, I mean, it could be that I have too many windows
So,
open. Just
Do we
one
have
second.
our committee assistant share on our screen? We
Okay,
can see the slides and then you can see them on your screen.
okay, all right. Maybe I'll do one more. Let me try one more.
Maybe she.
Got it, got it. I got it. Okay.
There we go.
I think I suffered from having way too many windows open because I've got way too many things going on today. So, okay. All right. So let's do this thing. Okay. So, um, okay. So what I want to do again is present the updated cost estimate and recommended weights for student-based funding formula in Vermont. And again, these is our approach to updating the cost estimates. We updated the analysis from the 2019 pupil weighting study to incorporate data for the 2019 and 2018-2019 school years through the 23-24 school years. The updated analyses generated a base per pupil cost. And then also it allowed us to identify necessary cost adjustments to this base per pupil cost for differences in student need and context. We then inflated these cost estimates into real fiscal year 25 dollars using something called ECI, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But just for context, I don't know about you, sometimes I always have to remind myself what fiscal year versus academic year. So fiscal year of 25 would be the 24-25 school year. And so that's the same, that would be for this school year. And we have our numbers in fiscal year 25, so you can compare them to other policy proposals that you may have been sort of bouncing around. And so those numbers should be comparable. We would not want to take a 24-25 number, right? A fiscal year 25 number, and for example, put that in statute for fiscal year 27, okay? And we can talk a little bit about one of the considerations is how you escalate a base. And that's something we've talked about in this committee in the past. But just know that the numbers you're seeing are fiscal year 25 numbers. And again, that's to help us for comparability with other policy proposals. So,
Excuse me, Professor, we have a question.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm curious, looks like you chose to use the BLS ECI index, and I'm just
Yeah.
curious about your choice of that index as opposed to some of the other possibilities.
Yeah, so the ECI index is an employment cost index. And so it is indexed to the rate at which, at least nationally, wages and compensation is growing, right? And there are other indices, and I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. For example, in Title 16 Vermont statute already uses NYPA. But NYPA is a product index, and so those two things might, right? For example, particularly wages, compensation can because of health insurance costs can increase at a very different rate than products that we might see in a consumer price index or a NYPA or something along those lines. So typically, when in school finance, when we do these kinds of escalations, we really lean into an employment cost, a type of an employment cost index, because the lion's share of education spending is for personnel and compensation related to personnel. Is that helpful?
They're very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So based on those analyses, what this table shows you is the base per student cost, the base cost per student and the cost adjustments. Okay, and just sort of remembering some of the other conversations I've had with the committee, right? Our base cost per student is the most efficient amount of spending for a student with no additional needs in a school district with no additional costs to attain average state proficiency standards in reading and math. right? So this is the most efficient spending level, right, to get to those outcomes. And that number is 15,033. Again, it's a little bit different from the number that we put up for you in January. That was our back of the envelope calculation, but I'm happy to hear that our back envelope calculation wasn't all that different. I think that number was 15.5. So the base cost per student that comes out of the updated models, and again, this is in fiscal year 2025 dollars, is 15,033. What you see down here are the additional dollars that we need to spend in order for certain student need groups to attain average outcomes, and the additional dollars needed to offset school context factors that are outside district control. So we identified in the updated analyses several student need factors, student experiencing economic disadvantage. And just to be clear, this is measured the same way as is currently in Act 127, and the additional cost to the state, and I want to be clear about that, to the state spending is 15,033. Why am I saying state spending? Because when we develop a state funding formula, and in a minute we'll talk about weights, those weights need to be for the state component, right? There is additional spending for students who experience economic disadvantage that is paid for by federal dollars. That's about $3,000. And in the memo that accompanies all these analyses, that's broken out.
Professor, we have another question, please.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't know she wanted to get through this page. Professor Colby, Representative Burkhart, I'm wondering, you said this is the amount that's needed to be spent to get to an average proficiency level. Is that a Vermont state average? And if
No,
so,
it's Vermont. No, these are all Vermont, right? And so
Right.
these
I
are.
guess the concern I had was that there's been a discussion about falling proficiency levels. And falling performance. So I just wondered how you're measuring that and like what year you're basing that off of and what is really meant, I guess, by getting to proficiency that we're all comfortable with in Vermont.
So I can provide you more information on that. But basically just conceptually what we do is we set a cut point that's equal to the state's existing standards for proficiency, right? Because that's what an adequate spend under sort of the Constitution, right? The state's obligation is to ensure adequate funding so that all students can meet state proficiency targets. So even if proficiency is falling, that's irrelevant, right? So what we're doing is we're modeling the dollars that are necessary for students to actually hit the state's proficiency targets.
But what is the state proficiency target though?
I can get those for you. Those are for ELA and math at grade level. And so I can get you those targets. I don't have them right here in front of me.
Okay, so
This is Representative Burkhart, this is the way that that all states consider this, and this is also the case for the evidence-based approach too, right? The goal in a school finance context, right? The state is for us to ensure an adequate spending amount for students to attain state performance targets.
Okay, thank you.
So to set the ground rules here at the table, we'll hold questions until she gets through a page or section. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So just back to the economic disadvantage, right? These are the state dollars. There would be federal dollars that go on top of this. So this is not the total spending that is needed for a student experiencing economic disadvantage. The total additional spending for a student experiencing economic disadvantage, say that 10 times fast, to attain, right, state performance standards, this would be the state share. The average additional spending for a student, an English learner, is $20,925. Under school enrollment in the updated models, you'll note here that there's a 0 for 101 for small schools with 101 to 250 students. Our updated models show that there is actually no difference in cost for schools with that enrollment. And so there's no need for a weight for for schools between 101 and 250 anymore. There is a cost adjustment for schools with less than 100 students, and that cost adjustment is $3,157. We found a similar thing in our analyses with population density, and so there's only a difference for under 55 persons per square mile, and that cost adjustment is 1,906. We did not find in the updated analyses that their cost adjustments are needed anymore for grade range and for middle grades or secondary grades. Let me stop there.
Representative Bodie?
Thank you. So I have a question here about the 36 to less than 55 miles.
Yep.
People per that. That takes into account that we're paying for all transportation, so it's still going to cost more. Why would it cost more?
It doesn't, these numbers do not include transportation that's paid for by the state's transportation grant. And Representative Bodie, that is, if I could put that in the parking lot, I'd like to come back to transportation because that is a consideration for the future funding formula.
Okay, thank you.
And I've got a pen, I'll make a note for parking lot issues.
Representative Wazazik?
Thank you, Dr. Colby. Just for purposes of reading this chart, for the school enrollment of less than 100 and the population density of less than 55, so the 3157 and the 1906 are added to the 1533.
Yes, yes,
Okay,
yes. And I
but
will
that
talk
is-
about, thank you. These are the actual cost adjustments for each one of these categories. They are additive. And so when we get to the weights are additive as well.
So same thing then for English learners and students with economic disadvantage.
That is correct.
So the student needs for economic disadvantage is 3066. And then English learners is 35-ish. Am I
Yes.
reading that? Okay,
Yes.
thanks.
Yeah. So we think about the base. And part of the reason I'd like to start with dollars rather than go right to weights, because remember how in January we talked about, like, we have to show what the dollars are relative to, right? So these are the additional costs, but if you change the base, then the weights would change, right? And so this allows you to understand sort of what's the additional spending for each one of these categories, and then you can see how that relates to the base.
Okay, Representative Holcomb?
So just to check my understanding, if we frame this a different way, I think what you're saying is that if we're choosing to educate kids in schools that are smaller than 100 kids, we're assuming we're going to spend an additional $3,157 for them.
Yes, as long as those students have no other additional needs. So if you were a
As a minimum.
student who experiences economic disadvantage and you were in a school less than 100 students, you would add the cost adjustment for the economic disadvantage plus the cost adjustment for the this small school. So these things are.
Representative Feltus?
Yes, thank you. I had a question regarding the grade range.
Mhm.
If our goal is to have the most efficient spending to get to the Vermont proficiency standards,
Mhm.
I am wondering why there is no additional amount needed for secondary grades, as an example.
We didn't find in our models we did not find in our models that additional dollars over and above the base were needed at the secondary level to attain outcomes.
Okay, I just am surprised at that, but thank you for your comment.
Representative Holcomb?
I'm trying to understand why that would be. Is that possibly because we're educating at greater scale at the high school level? And that scale offsets the cost?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes. So, I mean, one of the things, and we did not go into sort of the sub-analysis for the how and the why. We've only had a couple weeks to work with this, so we've been moving pretty fast. But I mean, so one of the questions you might ask yourself is, so there are some changes here. So if you look at column 2, we say, like, here are the cost adjustments we found in the 2019 study. Well, remember that those data went back 10 years, right? They went through the 2017-2018 school year and they went back to 2008. So we now have additional years of data, right? And so there have been changes in the cost structures around the state in that time. That's why this is a really good example, by the way, for why it is you do cost studies every 3 or 4 years, right? Because the context, the things change on the ground, right? And so this just shows that some of the things that have been changing over time in sort of our cost structures for education in the state have translated to different kinds of cost adjustments in a formula. So
Okay,
It could very well be the kinds of things that you're talking about. I mean, we didn't do a sort of a root cause analysis to try to figure out like why they changed. So. Am I okay to jump forward?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So with all those numbers in mind, those dollar figures now I want to talk about how we can use those cost estimates in a Vermont student-based funding formula. And so the first thing that we need to talk about is like, well, how do we set a base? And if we go back to what I talked to sort of with the committee about a week or so ago, right, we can think about a couple options here, right? So one option would be a single base, right? And if we use the numbers from the previous table, a single base spending amount in a funding formula would be this 15,033 per student. Again, that's for fiscal year 25. And again, that represents an adequate spending amount for a student with no additional needs to achieve state performance standards. There's a second option though, and the second option would be to have a simple variable base. And we talked a little bit about this when I was in last week. A simple variable base spending amount could account for differences in school size and whether or not a school is in a sparsely populated area. And I gave you 3 examples here, right? So you could create a base for small schools with less than 100 students, and that would be your base plus the 3157. You could create a base amount for schools located in sparsely populated areas, right? That would be your base amount plus the 1906. And you could create a base for small schools in sparsely populated areas, which would be the 15,033 plus this 5,063, which is the sum of the cost adjustments for small and sparse. And so if you had a simple variable base, you'd have 3 bases, right, that correspond to sort of school context. And then the third option that you could consider is a single base plus some sort of categorical grant program, right? Where you have your single base, but then you provide, kind of similar to what we used to do with small school grants plans, we provide a categorical grant program that is fixed per student that can go to students in small schools, sparse schools, or again, it could be the combination of both. There are trade-offs with all of these things, right? So again, with a single base, all of the cost adjustments and the weights would apply. But I know this committee has considered some concerns around whether or not having weights for small and sparse are inconsistent with other policy objectives the state has around consolidation, right? And whether or not having those weights might incentivize schools that are small by choice as opposed to geographic necessity to stay open. Option 2, right, addresses the fact that you still have that, and you could put some conditions, right, on whether or not a school qualifies for the base, right, a certain base. But the challenge with a variable base is that now you have to use different weights, right? Remember when I talked up above, we have all these dollar figures, and the weights, right, have to be relative to a base. So if I have 3 different bases, right, for these 3 different options, I'm going to have 3 sets of weights. And that introduces complexity into the system. The third option, right, is you just stay with single base and you pull out, right, small and sparse as categorical grants, and you run that as a side program. Again, you could have some control over sort of the qualification standards for those grants. But you don't apply weights on top of the categorical grant amount, right? Because it's out of it. So you would only then have student need weights, and those student need weights then would go on top of a single base. And then the school context cost adjustments would operate outside as a categorical grant program. Let me stop there. Those are three potential options, right? So you've got a single weight, a single base, a simple variable base where you could combine a single base with a categorical grant program. Questions?
Representative Kimball has a question.
Just one question on this. I imagine there is a minimum amount of a small grant, not so. So it'd be a number of students times the calculation on option 3, but a minimum amount of X. Were you thinking that was the case, or will we get to that later in your presentation?
I apologize. I'm not sure I'm following, right? So let me try to answer, but if I'm not answering, interrupt me. So the way a categorical grant program would work is that for each student, for example, in a school with less than 100 students, that categorical grant program would provide an additional $3,157 per student, because that $3,157 is the cost adjustment that we found in our analyses for the additional spending necessary for that student in that school.
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering if there's a minimum, a floor that you would have with that approach, or no
Minimum
floor,
number of
just
students or minimum number of dollars?
minimum number of dollars.
The cost adjustments are the cost adjustments. And so on all of these adjustments are on a per student basis. So that there isn't a range.
Okay. Thank you.
Rebecca, excuse me. Representative Burkhart has a question.
Dr. Colby, I asked you this question last week offline, but I thought your answer was really helpful to me. So I wonder if I could ask it again for the whole group.
Sure.
Which is, there was a lot of concern about districts that had much higher salary structures than other districts or regions of the state, even if we're combining them into bigger districts. And you had a very clear explanation to me about why that was less concerning to you when it came to potentially, because we had discussed in here, potentially setting a different base, for a region that had higher collective bargaining agreements with their teachers. But you had a very clear explanation. I just wonder if you could share that again with the bigger group.
Yeah, so our models use actual spending, right? So we haven't taken, for example, and said, well, a class of this and this salary, right, gets you this cost. So this is based on actual spending. And when we use actual spending across the state, it includes all the spending by high and low spending districts. So what you're seeing here is an average spending amount that reflects sort of the additional spending necessary for students to attain outcomes. But it's not based on, right, sort of some differentiation of teacher compensation, for example. If in fact you believe that there are substantial differences in compensation across the state, then in some instances, some states adjust for that. However, in Vermont, we did not find that, right? So in our analyses, right, like we looked to see whether or not there should be an input-based rate or input-based weight, right, that would adjust for that. We didn't find that in our analyses that was statistically significant. So what you're seeing here is actual spending, and it's actual spending per student. And that actual spending reflects actual wages and compensation as it is now.
Thank you.
Representative Odie.
Thank you, Dr. Colby. Assuming the weights help educate children in a very positive way, how could the choice among these options most protect the impact of the weights for students if the legislature and the governor underfund the base foundation amount?
So nothing in these analyses has anything to, our analyses are based on the dollars necessary for students to attain the state standards. There's nothing in these analyses that says what the impact would be if the dollars weren't spent, right? Other than the fact that we would not have our analyses saying, right, that schools and districts would not have the dollars they needed to educate students to standards. So if the formula was underfunded, right, and districts did not have, right, so one of two things would happen, right? Either districts wouldn't have the money they needed to put in place educational programs and services that are necessary for students who attend state standards. And so then the state is in trouble under an adequacy sort of framework. If in fact the state underfunds and some districts then are allowed to raise money to make up that money or have the ability to make up that money through local and others don't, then what you have two problems, right? The state has not met its constitutional obligation to provide sort of an adequate funding level, and the state has also created a situation where there are systemic fiscal inequities in the system. So our numbers tell you this is what has to be spent, right? on average for a student to achieve state standards. And so that sort of establishes what the state's funding obligation is, because the obligation is twofold, right? First, remember, if we go back to that presentation in January, I talked about sort of like, what are the obligations? And one of the obligations is to make sure that students get the standards. And the second one is to make sure that it's equitable with regard to opportunities.
Representative Wozniak.
So I don't want to cut me off if this is covered later in your presentation.
I won't
but
cut you
based-
off. I'll just put you in the parking lot.
Oh, there we go. Fair enough. Based on the comments you just made, would it be your recommendation then that under your proposal, we would not allow districts to raise any additional funding?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a policy consideration. It always is in a foundation formula, the extent to which you allow districts to raise and or spend dollars over the base, right? And in addition to the weights.
Do you have a recommendation on that policy decision?
You know, our analyses did not consider that, right? So what we did in our analysis is come up with sort of what the costs would be. I think that this is not an unknown question. Most states have to wrestle with this, right? And so most states make some decision about how much leeway above the base that they will allow districts to raise. For example, through local levies, right? Like what we see in Washington state. But usually those levies, right, are capped at a certain additional amount per student. Because if you don't, what happens is that you create a situation, and this is what happened pre-Act 60, right? Where you have certain towns and certain locations around the state who have who are able to raise more money, and so they do, right? And then that fundamentally destabilizes the equity within your system and with respect to opportunities to learn.
Well played, thank you.
But I can't recommend a particular standard. I think frankly, that's a matter for policymakers. But I will say that the states that put that in are pretty careful about it, and usually it is capped.
Thank you.
Representative Kimball.
Dr. Kobe, one question, and I think in your response to what Representative Odie asked, you said this is what the state has to spend in order to meet its standards. My question is it has to or is currently spending?
This is what you have to spend. This is not current spending.
Constitutional obligation.
Okay.
Right. So what we have modeled, right, is the relationship between spending and outcomes. And yes, we use existing data to do that. But you will note that this spending amount doesn't look necessarily like what a lot of districts in the state spend, both on the high and the low side, right? And so what we're doing is we are modeling the relationship between spending and outcomes to find the most efficient spending level necessary to attain outcomes.
Yes, so some districts will be above, some will be
Some
below.
districts are going to be above, some districts will be below. So Vermont's a bit unusual case because usually when we do this work, the base spending amount is usually above what most districts are spending, right? And so lots of times we're responding to adequacy court cases where districts are saying, hey, we're not funded enough, right? Vermont is a little unusual, and you've heard both APA and PICUS say the same thing, whereas we have a situation in Vermont where we actually have a good number of districts who spend above this amount. So that makes Vermont a little bit unusual, right? Because that's typically not the case. Usually when we set the base, they're more below than above. Here, we've got a pretty good mix, and I have a graph on that too I can share if that would be helpful. But, and I know the JFO is doing some very specific modeling and can sort of show what that is on a district by district basis. But I think I think the important point to take away here is that this is the optimal spending amount to attain student outcomes.
Thank you.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. Would you think that, because I think you said the state has a constitutional obligation. So do you think that putting that in the findings of the bill would strengthen the bill?
I would defer to legislative counsel on that. I'm not an attorney, so I feel like I would be getting out of my lane on that, but I would encourage you to raise that with legislative counsel.
Thank you.
Thank you. We can move
Can I
on.
jump ahead?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So we talked about the base. Well, now we have all those cost adjustments that we need to talk about, right? And just as a reminder, the updated analysis suggests that a future Vermont Foundation formula should include adjustments for students experiencing economic disadvantage, students who are English learners, students who receive special education services, school size, and school location. And again, the updated analysis suggests that the grade range should not be included as a cost adjustment. I want to call out number 3 and number 2 and number 3 just quickly around English learners. So you saw earlier, we created, we were able, based on the past analyses that we did, to create an average cost adjustment, right? Average dollar amount that would bring an English learner to standards. Our initial analyses for the pupil weighting study didn't include students with special education, right? In terms of the cost analysis, we identified it as a cost factor, but at that time, the decision was to maintain the census-based block grant. I'll talk about that in a few slides, but I just want to sort of set the table that in the context of a student-based funding formula, right, a census-based block grant would no longer be appropriate, right? That those two mechanisms don't work well together anymore. And so we need to sort of think about how it is then we integrate students with cost adjustments for students who receive special education services. And I have a number of slides that present you some options for doing that. For those options, you'll see that we drew on some different data sources because we had to, because our original models didn't model that in the same way. The other reason is that because of the small cell sizes that we have, small numbers of counts of students with disabilities, particularly in high need categories, we tend to stay away from statistically modeling, and we use other resource cost modeling approaches to determine the cost of the cost adjustments for students receiving special education. So I'm going to talk about each one of these here, but I just want to flag for you that students receiving special education services I'm going to talk about that differently. And again, up above what you saw was an average weight. And as I mentioned, I think in my January presentation, based on the 2024 report that I did for the JFO, we actually had the opportunity to create a more refined set of weights based on student need for English learner, and I'll talk about those too. So what are these? These are the average weights. Okay, and so the average weight for a student experiencing economic disadvantage is 1.02. Remember, this is state spending. If the federal dollars went away, the consolidated programs went away, the weight would be 1.22 because the state would have to make up those additional dollars. That has not happened yet. So, in developing a funding formula, I think you have to deal with what's on the table. And so that would be the 1.02, which would be the state spending. English learners is 1.39. So we do receive some federal funding for English learners, about $308,000. It only goes to 5 districts in the state, and on average, it's about $230 per student. So it's actually a very small contribution. So because those dollars only go to a handful of states, it's really hard to deduct it and still have it be fair, the weight be fair. But also, even if you deducted those dollars, the weight almost is unchanged because it's such a small amount of federal dollars. So for English learners, on average, the weight is 1.39. And then our school enrollment is 0.21, and then population density is 0.13. These are student weights, not tax capacity weights. They cannot be compared to the weights that we have in statute now. They also can't be compared to other states because remember, our weights are relative to our base. That's why I started with the dollars, right? So we're comparing, right? So we're taking the cost adjustment and we're comparing it to our base. So the weights that each state use needs to be cost-based, right? And where we have a base amount, in this case of 15,033, and then we take those additional dollars that I showed you earlier and we compare them to the base, and that's how the weight comes up. If we use a different base, right? Even if the cost adjustment is the same, but we use a different base, the weights change. So every state has a different base and every state has a different cost adjustment. So you have to be really careful about comparing weights across states. These are Vermont specific weights.
Representative Holcomb.
I Are you going to come back and talk about federal funding and students who are economically disadvantaged? Or should I ask now?
You can ask now.
You said we'd have to calculate it. I'll ask now because it's actually too complicated and I don't want to interrupt the flow. So
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I think I can provide you a simple answer, and then if you want more detail, we can talk about it. Is the total additional, if I go back up here, right, to our costs, right, the total additional spending necessary for a student experiencing economic disadvantage is about 18,000, and I can't look it up exactly because I'd have to close my screen, but so I'm going to round my number. It's around 18,000. However, around 3,000 of that comes from the federal dollars. So you have to deduct that. And that's how, remember, if you remember, the additional dollars, that the cost adjustment in dollars for a student experiencing economic was about 1533, right? Those are the dollars after the federal dollars come off, right? So the total would be sort of around 18. The weight that we use in the funding formula should reflect the state contribution, right? Like, we shouldn't be waiting for the state and the federal contribution. However, we are operating in quite uncertain times right now. And so it's interesting because this has come up in other conversations. Typically, we would never even talk about that, right? Like when we do this in other studies, we just always talk about the state weight, right? But to do due diligence, given the uncertain times we live in now, we wanted to be very clear that if those federal dollars went away, that the weight would have to go up, right, in order to make sure that there was an adequate additional, that we had adequate dollars for the cost, the total spending amount that we needed for a student experiencing economic disadvantage. Did that answer your question, Representative?
I said anyone can answer the question right now.
So, I mean, the simple answer is that under current circumstances, right, where if we continue to make the assumption that the state continues to receive consolidated federal funding in a manner consistent with historical practice, your weight is 1.02. The point being is that if the landscape was to change, and you, for example, was to lose all those dollars, for example, then the weight would go to 1.22. If something else happened, I guess the message is you just have to reevaluate this weight. That's all. But for right now, the 1.02 is the additional state spending, and that's really all you need to pay attention to, I think, for right now. But again, trying to do due diligence and helping everybody understand sort of how it is that potential changes at the federal level might impact some of the decisions that you're making now.
Thank you very much. And just to clarify, I mean, one of the things I've looked at in the NCES data from the F-33 collection is that Vermont spends more on student support per student than other states, which suggests that we provide more social services through districts than some neighboring states, I think. So this base is based, and the weight for disadvantage is based on assumptions about how Vermont treats poverty.
That's
But
right.
those assumptions could be different. These services could be
They could be-
provided
they
through
could- they
social
could be
service
different.
agencies instead.
Sure.
But if
Sure.
we're not providing them through social service agencies, I think fall back on school districts, which is why we need to compensate in the weights in school districts. Is that the right
Yes.
way to say this?
I
Okay.
think what you're saying is making sense. I think it's also an example of why it is we have to do state specific cost studies, right? Because the underlying structure and assumptions for what spending looks like and what the assumptions are about sort of how we organize schools and schooling is different, right? So, we did a cost study using the same methods in New Hampshire. We got really different results, right? Because New Hampshire is really different from Vermont. And so that's why we have to do these on a state-by-state basis, and we have to be careful to make sure that when we're thinking about cost-based funding amounts and weights and things along those lines, we have to be careful to make sure that we're taking into account the existing cost structures and the context of the state.
So just to be clear, if we were a state, like some states, like Massachusetts, pushes the social services in from the social service sector, if Vermont chose, it could also provide these services through the state agencies, and then it wouldn't be being picked up in school budgets.
That's
And we
correct.
would have to calculate, okay, interesting.
If you pulled the dollars out of, let's say you pulled those services out of schools, right? And they were all provided by the designated agencies, right? And so the schools were no longer spending money on those. Then yes, then your base would go down and probably your cost adjustments would go down. Because it wouldn't be included in school spending.
And inversely, if you level funded DAs or cut social services, you might expect higher costs in school districts.
Only if school district spending went up, right? So I want to be careful here, right? Just, we don't know. I mean, one scenario could be that if social services spending was somehow cut or limited outside of schools, schools might choose or might have to spend more to compensate to fill that vacuum. That could happen. And if that happens, then yes, their base spending amount and potentially their cost adjustments would go up. But that would have to schools would have to make a choice to do that, right? It's not necessarily a 1-for-1. It could also be that the funding for services outside schools goes away. Schools decide not to, right? For whatever reason, and then the services just aren't provided. So I want to be careful, right? Just because the dollars are cut outside of schools doesn't necessarily mean that the dollars end up in school budgets.
Thank you.
So one of the things I mentioned before is, so we have in this average weight of 1.39 for students, for English learners, right? And so what that is an average. But what we also know is that the additional costs, the cost adjustments, right, for students, for English learners vary by language proficiency level. And this comes out of that 2024 report I did for you. And they vary a lot. Right. So it goes all the way from around, and again, these numbers are in fiscal year 25 for comparability. They varies from around 31,657 all the way down, right, for a student, and level 1 is the sort of the lowest level of language proficiency, right, to students who are basically transitioning out of sort of having English learner status. That's 1,795. Right, that's almost, a $30,000 difference, right, between the two students. So the challenge with using one weight when you have such variability in cost adjustments is that one weight's always wrong, right? Because it's an average, right? It's not going to be right. You're not adjusting properly, right, for any student in any one of these categories. It's an average. So there is an opportunity here for the state to adopt a more refined set of English learner weights that correspond with WIDA language proficiency levels. AOE does collect information on students on these. That's how, we were able to do that study. And you can see that the weights would vary considerably, right? So the weight for a level 1 WIDA proficient student, level 1 WIDA proficiency would be 2.11, whereas a level students in level 5-6, which are really students who are transitioning out, would be 0.12. In Vermont, we also have a population of students who we consider newcomers or sort of have limited language proficiency in their home language, Horse Life. And that is additive, right, to whether or not they're an English learner. And I think you've heard this in testimony, particularly from districts like Winooski and Burlington, where they have English learners, but they have English learners who are also new Americans. And so there's an additional cost of providing services to newcomer and SLIFE students which is over and above the English learner the cost of for just providing sort of the services for an English learner. And that is about $6,329 per student. And that is that would be a weight of 0.42. So what you see here is you have the opportunity to adopt a refined set of weights for English learners that would account for differences in costs associated with these different levels of language proficiency and whether or not a student is a newcomer or SLIFE. Or you could adopt a single weight, which is the average that I showed you before, which is 1.39. Questions?
Representative Wazazzi.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Colby. So you said it was additive. So a newcomer who's in level 1 would be the 31 and change plus the 6,000 and change.
If they were a level 1 and a newcomer, yes.
Yep. And is that also additive in comparison to the base, or is the base already included in
These
that
are
30?
all additive into the base, right? So these are all cost adjustments on top of the base.
So you'd be looking at like over 50,000, okay, great, so.
My understanding, and I would encourage you to speak with AOE, who is the program folks there who can talk to you more about Newcomers Life. This is not a long-term status, right? For a student, and so you wouldn't necessarily expect a student to remain in Newcomers Life beyond sort of an academic year. And I think that's why you see that sort of the dollar adjustment is smaller, right? Because this is sort of a time bound. I think that, so you wouldn't necessarily have that as an additive weight more than for sort of in perpetuity for a student. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Representative Odie.
Dr. Hobie, maybe you said this and I just didn't catch it. Who is doing the assessments of what level?
Yeah.
Children are at?
Yeah, there's something called the WIDA assessment. It is what what districts administer, and it's the data that are collected by the state. And I would
State,
encourage you
yeah.
to speak with the agency program staff. They have a lot of, they can really help you understand more about how the WIDA works.
Okay, and is it WEDA?
Yep.
WIDA.
World-class
Thank you.
instructional design and assessment.
I had a hard time
Representative-
hearing. I'm sorry. Could you say that again?
We're just saying the name of the
Oh,
organization.
thank you.
Right down.
Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Holcomb.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a broader question about that assessment because these weights are sometimes make people nervous because if they're determined based on an assessment, the question is what's the incentive to make sure students move through progressive proficiency if they're financially rewarded for slow growth?
Yeah.
Could you talk about what states do on that? And
Yeah,
why-
and
why
again,
good accountability
I'm gonna
oversight
lean
matters?
on the agency staff to talk a little bit about that. I am not an expert in English learner instruction, okay? I can talk about the costs, and so my understanding is that there are some guidelines for how long students should be at certain proficiency levels, and that the state monitors to make sure that students are progressing through these levels, and that's part of what the agency is doing. So I would encourage you to talk to the agency about sort of the programmatic questions. I did work very close with the agency to develop these cost estimates. And I want to say they were really great partners in the work, but they are really the experts on the programmatic side.
Representative Holcomb.
So I guess the question I have is, I think this is wonderful work and WIDA is well-known and nationally respected. I think the question is, we would probably as a committee need to make sure, particularly if federal funding is cut, that there is sufficient capacity at the agency to ensure that these weights work as intended.
Again, I would
Because
encourage you to speak with the program staff, Anne and others over at AOE. They were great partners in doing the study. And I know they were supportive of going to something that was based on proficiency levels, and they can talk to you more about how they sort of support and monitor progression through. I'm just not a program expert, and I don't want to get out of my lane here.
Representative Odie.
It's probably on what you said that you're not really qualified to speak on, but I was going to ask if I suppose districts could, in some BOCES sense, if their federal funding went away, they might put money together to hire someone who could do a WIDA program.
Well, so Representative Odie, again, I would encourage you to talk to the agency about this, but
Yeah.
like, for example, so we really have 5 districts in the state that have sort of a critical mass of English students who are English learners, right? And those 5 districts are the only 5 districts that get federal Title III funding. And they are, unfortunately, if I look it up, I may get it wrong, so I just can't flip my screen here, but they are Burlington, South Burlington. Well, I'm not going to say off the top of my head, but those 5 districts are the only ones that get it. Let me see, do I have to clear my piece of paper. So they would be the only places that would be impacted by that. And the dollar amounts for that are only about $308,000. I think it was 23-24. It works out to be about $238 per student. So it's the federal dollars for English learners is actually rather small in this state. And then we have a large number of districts in the state that have really small numbers of English learners. And I know that that's something that the agency is looking at because, and this is in the report that I wrote, it's really difficult to get to scale in those places. And so I know that's something that the agency is thinking about. But again, I am happy to come back and make another presentation with the agency on the 2024 report if you'd like more detail about that. But so.
Thank you very much.
We can move on, please.
Okay. The second thing we need to think about are cost adjustments for students receiving special education. And I think I mentioned before, we didn't include in our statistical models additional costs for students receiving special education, both because of data limitations, and typically we don't do education cost function modeling for students with disabilities because, again, we're measuring toward outcomes, and the cost of the additional cost of special education, the cost adjustment for special education should be the dollars necessary to implement a student's IEP. So you're sort of apples and oranges here a little bit, right? And so the base amount needs to be the amount of dollars for, on average, students get to proficiency, right? Academic standards, but then the dollars for special education are the additional dollars necessary to implement a child's IEP. So there are two major cost studies that have been done. The first one is by the U.S. Department of Education. It's called the Special Education Expenditure Project. It is widely viewed as the gold standard. And this is the cost estimates for this are for over 10,000 students nationwide with sufficient sample sizes in all these cells. I will say that the cost, and again, both of these dollars for the CEPR and fiscal year 2025 dollars. The CEP was last done in 1999-2000. I'm actually leading the update for that called the National Study of Special Education Spending. So we were until we had a stop work order a few weeks ago in the business of actually updating these numbers, which is why I also then pulled the numbers from a recent study, which is the Ohio Special Education Cost Study, which is the most comprehensive state study that's ever been done on special education costs. It was done in 2022. And so what you can see here at first, I think that's a big takeaway and really important to remember when we start to talk about including weights or some sort of cost adjustments in the overall formula, is that special education costs vary considerably according to student disability, and they vary considerably according to need. Disability category not always corresponds with need, but it's a rough approximation. And so you can see that, for a student with specific learning disability, if we use the Ohio cost study, right, it's about $9,721 to implement their IEP. Versus, a student with major, what we consider other health impairment, a major other health impairment, which was significant need, could be as much as $59,000, almost $60,000. So just like with the English language learner weight, if we choose one weight, right, it's always going to be wrong, right? Because you've got so much variation. So one of the tricks here that you have to think about is, well, then how do we develop good cost adjustments for students receiving special education in the context of a student-based funding formula? So there are three options I'm going to sort of put on the table. The first one is you could do a single weight. And if you did a single weight, the single weight would be relative to the base of 15,033, and this would be using the Ohio data. Is 1.97 for each student receiving special education. Another option would be multiple weights based on disability categories. And here you just assign weights based on each disability category. 3 states nationwide who have student-based funding formula use that approach. And what I will say, by the way, is 23 of the 37 states that have student-based funding formula use either a single or a multiple weight to adjust for students, adjust for the additional costs of providing special education services. So weights are the predominant approach. The other approach used within the context is some sort of fixed grant, but we've kind of talked about like why that gets wonky, because then you've got to always be adjusting to dollars. So there are three options again: the single weight, multiple weights you could do based on disability category. We do have a number of states who do that. And then you have option 3, you could have multiple weights based on disability categories grouped by cost. And these cost-based groupings are ones that we developed for the National Study on Special Education Spending using extant data to figure out how to group sort of disability categories according to cost. And so you could have low-cost disabilities, which have specific learning disability and speech and language impairment, and the weight would be 0.79 if you use the Ohio data. Medium cost disabilities, which include students with emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, and other health impairment, that'd be 1 point, and that's OHI minor. That'd be 1.35. High cost disabilities would be students with autism spectrum disorder, deaf blindness, hearing impairment, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, traumatic brain injury and visual impairment, and OHI major, and that would be 2.49. So I talked to you a little bit about the trade-off already on single weights. So single weights are always wrong, right? Like you've got so much variability, and that makes them inefficient and inequitable. That said, 9 states do use single weights, and by reference, Maine does use a single weight, and their single weight is 1.5. Option 2 with the disability categories, one of the concerns that is sometimes raised with disability categories is that it can incentivize, because the weights differ, for students to be classified one way versus another way. My colleague Beth Dewey and I wrote a paper on this. There is really no research evidence to suggest that that occurs, although, you know, we do, I mean, anecdotally, you hear that that happens. So I just want to be clear, while anecdotally we hear that happens, and that there really isn't good research evidence to suggest that that happens sort of on a large scale. But it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And then the third option is, again, with the multiple weights, is by grouping students within these cost-based grouping according to disability categories according to cost, you moderate sort of the incentive effects of sort of one disability versus another, right? Because you might be gaming the system to get, you know, a different weight based on disability category. But what you do is you're less granular, right? And so these are averages within certain, you know, cost-based tiers. Right? So what could that look like? I've got a table here, so you can kind of see how this all plays out. So if you went for the single weight, again, this would be the 1.97. These other blues, right, are the weights for the cost-based tiers. And then you can see here for each disability category what the weight would be. These weights are based on the cost adjustments from the Ohio Special Education Spending Study that have been put in fiscal year 2025 dollars and compared to the Vermont base, which is the 15,033. That was a lot of information, so let me stop there.
Representative Maslin.
Yes, Professor Colby, just some interim reflections on option 3. Using the categories that you've outlined saves a little work, I guess, on the part of whoever's going to assign the we're going to arrive at the weights, you know, the additive portions of the weights. There's some disadvantages in that we're relying on somebody else's work product, I guess. But then on the other hand, it would eliminate our squabbling amongst ourselves about which way to go. So just a comment, and certainly there's the slide that's up right now there's a lot of work that's been done and put into that, and it's something that we can use. I just wonder if you could comment a little bit on what I'm trying to articulate about using this work product that's available, trying to fiddle around with it ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, so the U.S. Department of Education Special Education Expenditure Project is the gold standard in the field for understanding what it costs to serve a student, what it costs to implement a student's IEP by disability category and other other things, right? And so again, this is based on national data, right? 10,000 students across 50 states. And so what that does is by taking those national averages, right, it washes out some of the idiosyncratic kinds of things that might be specific to a particular district or even a particular state. So on average, nationally, what this tells us is that this is the average additional cost and the average additional spending necessary to implement a child's IEP within each of these disability categories. Is there variation around these averages? Yes, there is. But these are the best national estimates. What you'll see when you compare it to the Ohio data, which are from 2022 and also now put in fiscal year 2025 dollars, is that the cost estimates from Ohio look really close to what we see in the national. There are some differences, and the differences are at the medium cost and the high cost disabilities. And what we expected to see in the national study that I'm doing right now is data that looked more like Ohio for some of these categories because the service delivery models have changed a little bit since 1999 on average nationally and sort of what's considered best practices. And also we know that there are higher levels of student need. So for example, for the category emotional disturbance, the national estimate, right, for the additional spending for that to implement a child's IEP who has been identified with emotional disturbance is around 19, let's use round numbers, 20,000, okay? Well, Ohio using professional judgment panels, right? And also then considering student, more contemporary student needs found that the additional cost was closer to 31. That's not unsurprising to the field. And so there are some differences between the two, which is why I would suggest going with the Ohio. But what I would say is these are extremely comprehensive studies, right, that have used resource cost modeling to build the estimates from the bottom up to talk about what the optimal level of spending should be in terms of Ohio. And then what the SEEP did is with the 10,000 students, we actually costed out exactly what was on their IEP to figure out what the additional spending is. You cannot figure out additional spending for a student receiving special education services using financial data because the financial data are not granular enough. And so that's why, we did the SEEP before, and that's why we are in the process of doing the National Special Education Spending Study. And the goal with the national studies is to provide benchmarks for states on what exactly should be spent on average to implement a child's IEP within a disability category.
Representative Maslin, follow up.
Just brief follow-up. I'm looking at the slide and noticing that quite a lot of differences, high-cost disabilities, for example, where
Yeah.
autism, 30,000 versus 40,000 rounded up. As this conversation develops, I would, perhaps you could help us understand more about the differences, or maybe you just did on that.
Yeah, the differences are this, right? So the SEEP is still considered the national standard. The Ohio study, which we did in 2022, uses professional judgment panels where educators were asked to consider sort of contemporary student need and talk about sort of what and best practices and right in terms of service delivery models that are contemporary. And so we did find some differences there. And what we understand, the reason we understand that these differences exist is because the needs of the students have changed over time.
Gotcha.
Right? And we have seen changes in practices over time. And so the numbers, particularly for high cost disabilities, have changed, but they have not changed very much for low cost disabilities, right? Or even for many of the categories of, right? So if you look at OHI for minor, the national average is 17, Ohio's 18, right? So there are some differences, but those differences are really pegged to two things. One, changes in student need over time, and two, changes in best practices.
Thank you. Helpful.
Representative Holcomb.
Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful work. And the numbers don't surprise me at all, but I do think it's calling into question some decisions that we may have to make here, and I just want to check what those assumptions are against what you're saying. The first thing that occurs to me is that scale is going to matter. And one of the things that we've talked about is using boards of collaborative education services or bigger districts to sort of share risk, because it looks like in a district that had more kids with disabilities, this would be more stable over time. If you were in a bigger district or a bigger BOCES, but that in a smaller system, it might be a little bit more challenging to manage. And I only say this having worked in a school that developed a reputation for handling a specific kind of high cost disability well. And what we found is families moved to our district for those services. And so you can end up with a disproportionate number, and I'm glad we were able to serve them, but it does have an impact on your budget. So I think this is an argument for scale here in support of students with disabilities to be able to manage that. But I'd love your check on that. And then the other thing is I'm looking at these high cost disabilities, and we, like any one of our private therapeutic schools, charges far above this. So is this also, we're going to have some hard thinking around how we provide and support these children? Because in our current structure, that seems like it's misaligned with our funding.
Okay, let me, I think there are two questions in here. So the first question is these are the costs to implement a child's IEP, right? And so certainly, right, and so when we cost that out, we look at the actual services provided on the IEP. And so, and many of those services are individualized. However, if they're provided in group settings, then we adjust for that too. So scale matters, sort of, right? And so when we're implementing IEPs, it's not sort of like and like for like small group instruction where we gain efficiencies or bigger class sizes or something like that, right? Where we do consolidation, right? Like this is what costs to provide the services are on students' IEPs. Now, part of the reason, just generally, and this isn't in Vermont, right? This is everywhere, is, there are lots of questions about how decisions are made about what's put on IEPs, right? And that's not a problem Vermont's going to solve, right? And so, but right now, what is on the IEP is essentially the contract between the school district and the family and the child. And the school district has to provide those services at no cost to the student or family. And it is the only entitlement in education, right? So that's why the additional cost, the cost adjustment for a student receiving special education needs to be the dollars that it takes to implement the IEP and not some other metric, right? And so scale can matter, but it is very specific to student need, right? And what's on the IEP. The second question is around sort of these thresholds amounts, like these are averages. And so on average, yes, it costs about, nationally, we would say around $30,000 for based on the CEEP, be 30,000, on Ohio, closer to 40 for a student with an autism spectrum disorder. Both of those numbers are below our high cost kid threshold in Vermont. And I do talk about that in the memo. It could be that certain students are above that. These are averages, right? That said, one of the things we have to talk about is that these are based on national data for on average what we would expect students about what the additional spending should be to implement a child's IEP. So if for example, Vermont's average spending for, I don't know, a student with an emotional disturbance is, some magnitude, I don't know, make it up a number, 2 times the number that we see for Ohio, right? That would be that, and that number, that average being higher is driven by the fact that we're placing students out of district in private schools or private placements or therapeutic schools, then that's a serious concern. And so cost concern. And so I think then the question is to really understand why. Are we placing students outside of districts at a higher cost because the districts are unable to serve those students due to scale or staffing, right? That's one. Or is this a preference on the part of the districts to serve students outside the district. If it's a preference on the part of districts to serve the student out of district or to place them in a therapeutic school, for example, then that violates IDA, right? Because you're not just free appropriate public education, it's supposed to be in the least restrictive environment. And the least restrictive environment would be their home district. So I think what these numbers do as a benchmark, right? They provide a benchmark for thinking about spending patterns that we see in the state, but these are really solid average spending amounts, right? And again, there'll be variability. And the high cost kid program, which 27 states have, is intended to provide an insurance policy for when the average is way off, right? So when you have a child and the needs truly are $100,000 a year, and yet the weight for that child is the weights assume, on average, the additional spending would be 37, right? We don't want to hold districts in a position where they have to come up with that additional dollars. Like that's what the high cost, but high cost kid programs should be an insurance policy. They should not be the primary funding mechanism, right, for providing additional dollars for certain types of students. That was a long answer. I hope does that help, Representative Holcomb?
That was, yeah, I do one quick, that was incredibly helpful. And so I guess the other thing I would say to the committee is we need the insurance policy, but we clearly need capacity of the agency to ensure this is working as intended. And the rising extraordinary costs may suggest we aren't managing this at the agency. It may be a capacity issue. They're good people. There may not be enough of them. Just saying.
Representative Brannigan.
Yes, I agree, Representative Holcomb. I think there's some problem over there that we ought to focus on and help them out a bit. Doctor, thank you from me too for coming in and taking time to speak with us again. You've given us a lot of time this semester and I think and I want you to know that it's been a long time since I've been in this field. So this amount of money does surprise me. I'm very surprised by it. And so somebody along the way in the last couple of weeks, it may have been you, told us that the easiest special ed condition to fix is little children, K through 3, speech articulation problems. And but I see here, well, maybe it is the least expensive on this list, but it's still $10,000. Am I reading that chart correctly?
14,000.
14,000. So
For a child, just to clarify, this is for a child whose primary disability, right, is a speech or language impairment, and they have an IEP, right? So remember, to qualify to have an IEP, you've gone through sort of all the determinations, right, that student meets sort of the criteria. And, those are some pretty stringent criteria. There can be, right, so this is the cost of the additional providing on average the additional services to this child. But
Okay,
to your
so
point, I think you're bringing up a really good point here, right? And I think the good point you're bringing up is that special education is expensive. It is expensive. And it also, and so part of Act 173, and I was part of that research team then too, right? Like one of the goals of Act 173, I mean, we oftentimes think of Act 173 as a funding statute. No, it's not. Act 173 was a special education reform statute, right? And where we had an emphasis on multi-tiered systems of support, where we had a focus on early identification, where we had a focus on really, thinking hard about our service delivery systems. And you've heard testimony, I've heard the testimony too, now over the last month or so, even from like Nate Levinson, right? Who's also part of the group who, I worked with Nate when we on 173. 173 hasn't been implemented. And so, we want to make sure that we always want to make sure that we are appropriately identifying students for special education. If a student has a disability and qualifies for special education services, then they are entitled to those services. However, we also want to make sure that when we make that determination, that it truly is a that student truly has a disability, and that we have done all the other things to support that student first, right? I'm not talking about gatekeeping, but to your point, like early intervention is really important, right? Like we should be doing early intervention, right?
Yeah, and with these little ones, so the comment I made may anger people, but these little ones, kindergarten through third grade, pre-K through third grade, maybe they outgrow it. By the time they're in the third grade, they learn how to say TH and CH, and it might just be a maturity thing.
Well,
Or
I
maybe
mean,
not.
not all I cannot speak off the top of my head, but a large percentage of students who are identified for special education don't have IEPs throughout their trajectory, right? You know, there are people, right? And we have early intervening services, right? We have we have IDA Part C. And so, yeah, right, like that makes sense. But I think for the purposes of today's discussion and thinking about the weights, the big takeaway is that it costs additional dollars to implement students' IEPs. You have two of the best studies in the nation here that provide cost estimates. In many cases, the cost estimates are very close. I think there are reasons to think why the CEAP estimates for some of the higher cost disabilities might be underestimates, given changes in student needs since when the CEAP is done, was last administered. And unfortunately, I don't have the new study isn't quite done yet. But I do, having been part of both of these studies, I can say that I feel pretty confident in saying that I think the Ohio special education study numbers are probably the best reflection of the additional costs of providing of implementing student IEPs with best practices.
Thanks very much.
Professor Colby,
Yeah,
this committee could use a 5-minute break. Does that work for you?
I could use a 5-minute break.
5 minutes.
Okay.
We're on 5 minutes, Mr. Chair?
5.
5 minutes.
Carolyn, my friend.
Don't call your listener.
Don't make me.
Hold my lister here.
I assume you're talking like
Emily or something.
In South Burlington. A lot of districts have not been able to implement Act 173. South Burlington working really hard and spent a lot of money toward it. But I think one of the examples of implementing that is little kids who are identified, and to your point, are identified, who do have speech language impediments. Mike Freddie was one of these, a bunch of his cohort, they never made it to the IEC level because they intervened early in the home. So there was a speech language impediment. Freddie was pretty, we had a permission slip that we signed, and then Freddie pulled out a class. Speech language pathologist, and sometimes she worked in groups with us, and sometimes it was one-on-one. And by the time he got to, he graduated during COVID, so it must have been first or second grade. First or second grade, he graduated by finishing on video with her, which was really hard. But there was a whole group of them in his grade that never made it to IEP level because they had that mild intervention.